Today's budget will deliver on our promise of change.
This week on The Sceptic, I speak to John O'Connell, Chief Executive of the TaxPayers Alliance, on Rachel Reeves' disastrous benefits budget.
I think people are starting to see what Labour are doing as a profound attack on a British way of life. Labour don't like that you've got a pension. They don't like that there's agricultural land that's being passed down to the next generations. They just don't like that sense that they're not in control. And so that idea that they can control people by taking their money, people can feel it and they can see it.
And for our premium subscribers, I speak to Dr. Tilak Doshi, the Daily Sceptic's environment editor, on how COP flopped.
Yeah, I think it was pretty much a flop, full of diplomatic contortions, procedural chaos, and a mishmash of futuristic policy statements.
Hello and welcome to episode 60 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Now, so that we could bring you a reaction to the budget, as you can see, I'm not in the studio this week, but I'm very pleased to be joined down the line by John O'Connell, who is the Chief Executive of the TaxPayers Alliance. Welcome to The Sceptic, John.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, very good to have you here. Plenty to get into in the budget today, what it means for the economy, what it means for taxpayers, John. But I suppose let's just start with that astonishing, almost farcical leaking of the details of the budget around an hour before it was delivered by Chancellor Rachel Reeves yesterday. And so this was, of course, by the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is supposed to be the fiscal watchdog that lends Treasury announcements extra soundness and credibility. So, well, what did you make of that, and how damaging was it?
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary. In years past, that would be deemed sacking offence for somebody. This is market-sensitive information. It's very important that people understand the gravity of that. It's, if somebody quick and smart got wind of that, they could have made quite a bit of money. So there's a reason that these things are held back and kept on ice until the Chancellor stands up and makes his or her announcements. It was a bit of a car crash watching it unfold. So I think I then started to hear on the old WhatsApp group started to pop off quite a bit with people coming up with quite interesting conspiracy theories. And did they do this on purpose? They didn't. They were worried that perhaps that the markets would respond badly to the budget, so they didn't want a screenshot of Rachel Reeves with the market tickers underneath her. I'm not sure about that. It just seems like simple error. And also the look on the Chancellor's face did suggest it was something that she knew nothing about. Of course, the Tories went away and scribbled furiously and were able to give a very punchy response to the Chancellor's budget. And I wonder whether that extra buffer of time allowed them to come up with some good lines to throw back at the Chancellor. But yeah, it's quite extraordinary, unprecedented. And yeah, given the sort of terrible stage management of the budget up until the budget, it was just the icing on the cake really for a terrible few months of panic press conferences and reversing decisions and all of this kind of stuff. So maybe it was just par for the course when it came to the management of this particular budget.
Quite. And I suppose in some way on the day, the people that benefited the most was actually journalists who didn't have to listen to the whole speech and already had it in their lap. And of course, looking at that would be our report, but also the speech as well, for the key takeaways of the budget, there are a lot to talk about, but what were they for you? And I suppose who was being hit hardest, John?
Well, almost everyone, unfortunately. It sort of feels like, for me, that the last budget was an attack on business and this one was more of an attack on individuals. Last year, of course, we had the employers' national insurance increase, which is eventually passed down to individuals, but at the same time felt more like with business property relief and agricultural property relief, it sort of felt like an assault on business, with this one around an assault on families, where we had a freezing of the income tax thresholds. That's obviously going to bring lots more people into tax and push people on modest salaries into higher rates of tax in quite short order. The 40% rate was obviously designed for people on good salaries, in fact, very high salaries originally. And that's sort of crept down and down such that it's now pulling people on very modest incomes into it. So that will be a huge impact. And then another one that is being talked about, but sort of flying by the wayside a bit, is the tax on salary sacrifice pension schemes. Now, the reason I'm finding this one so difficult to stomach is there's this sense that people are squirreling money away into their pensions to hide it away from the needy public services. Is anything but. The reason that lots of people in what you'd call the sort of, I suppose, the young professional category are sacrificing their salaries into pensions is because of the tax and benefit scheme as it stands already is forcing them to do so. When somebody starts to earn £100,000, there is a cliff edge there where between 100 and around 125,000, your personal allowance is withdrawn. So your marginal tax rate between 100 and 125,000 is actually somewhere around as above 60%. Then you've also got the free, in inverted commas, childcare, 30 hours a week that parents can use, which is on the benefit side. Now that only applies if your salary is below £100,000. Now, of course, an anomaly there is if one earner in a household is on 101, the other one's on 0, you don't get the free childcare. Whereas if one's on 99, the other's on 99, you do get the free childcare, which doesn't make sense to start with. But what it does is all of these cliff edges and the alignments between tax and benefits, it's forcing people to kick their salary into pensions. And yes, they will enjoy that later in life, don't get me wrong, and it might even be a wise decision in some regards. But for families that need liquidity, if they have any sort of purchasing decision that they want to make, that they're less liquid than they otherwise might want to be. So they're the two main sort of high impact things for individuals, and I suppose both of them are equally flagship because they break that promise of not raising taxes on working people. That's income tax going up on working people. That's national insurance going up on working people on the pension side, because that's what will be applied to pension contributions from 2029 onwards.
Yeah, and people will be particularly outraged, frankly, that the taxes have gone up on working people, as you say, when a lot of the additional spending, which is actually in the budget, is going to seemingly be going on benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. Uprated by more than inflation. The removal of the cap on claiming benefits for more when you have more than 2 children. It was a welfare budget for sure. It's a sort of benefits bonanza, as we called it at the Taxpayers Alliance, and it is people who are getting up off their backside and going to work every single day, running a business, maybe working in 2 jobs, doing whatever they can to provide for themselves and their families, contributing to their local community. They're the ones that are paying for all of this. And what I found really interesting yesterday was just how aggressive the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, was in response to the budget, in a good way. I thought it was an excellent response to the budget, and I thought particularly impressive. She didn't do this mealy mouth thing that politicians constantly do, which is, of course, we need to remember that some people suffer, and then give a terrible answer. She just went straight for, no, this is about working taxpayers, functioning businesses, funding an ever-increasing welfare state. And she was quite forthright in that, and I appreciated that fresh approach, actually. And I think it's something that people outside of politics feel very viscerally. The TPA does lots of work around the country, so I'm constantly going to see businesses, supporters, activists, all of this kind of thing. And the anger with which people talk about how they're funding an ever bigger welfare state is palpable. And it was refreshing to see a politician channel it for once, rather than sort of tiptoe around it. But yeah, this was definitely a welfare budget. The benefits bill will be going above 400 billion by the end of the forecast period, which is absolutely enormous, an increase of over 70 billion. These are just mind-boggling numbers. And again, we are talking about huge spikes in claimants on quite often spurious mental health grounds. Very unprovable. There's no face-to-face assessment. Even GPs are signing off people from their jobs for extended periods of time. So what we're seeing is a huge explosion in those kind of nebulous claims. So some robust actions needed on that. But unfortunately, we went completely the other way yesterday. And it was clearly a sop to the backbenchers, of whom they lost control back when they were trying to bring the welfare bill under control. but they lost control of the backbenchers back then, and they were clearly in the driving seat yesterday. You heard the cheers when the announcement on the removal of the 2-child benefit cap was announced. If you're there's that famous meme, Nicholas 30, who is paying, working hard in a job, worked hard at their degree, and just feels like they're getting clobbered at every single stage of their life to pay for people to sit on the sofa.
Quite, and it does seem to make a mockery out of that idea of Labour being the party of the working class, of constantly talking about working people in this budget and the way they advertise it. But as you say, it seems to be oriented more towards, welfare, as you say, but also actually a sop to the Labour backbenchers. We know that Rachel Reeves has been wobbling quite a lot recently, as has Keir Starmer, but it's trying to shore up her position within the party, and particularly that sort of signal issue, the 2-child benefit cap. Now, I suppose just give us a bit more detail about that. But again, there's a concern there that hard-working families paying a lot of tax will only perhaps be able to afford 1 or 2 children already, but they will be paying tax towards others who have had many more.
You've hit the nail on the head, Laurie. The reason the cap was brought in the first place, and there's debate to be had about that specific policy to start with, but in principle, the reason it was brought in was to ensure that there was a level playing field between people who are working and raising a family and people on benefits and raising a family, in that you have to make difficult decisions. There are lots and lots of working families that can't go past 2 children because they just can't afford it. They can't afford a slightly bigger house. They can't afford, if they use private school, they can't afford school fees. And if they don't, then they can't afford additional school uniform and clothes and holidays and another car seat in the car. All of these things that families have to consider when they're trying to raise a family, but people on benefits previously didn't, then did, and now won't have to consider. And there are, I think it was, I saw 18,000 families that have, 5 or more children, who, in line to receive quite a big boost in their benefits bill. So, the principle of families on benefits having to make considerations in the same way that a working family does was a sound one. But yeah, you going back to your original point, I think it's a very interesting one that, who is Labour's constituency now? You felt like under the Tony Blair years and then beyond, it started to become less of a working class party and much more of a middle manager, professional kind of, slightly centre left kind of voters party in major urban centres, London, Cambridge, Manchester, elsewhere. Is it even that anymore? Do they speak for professionals when they're soaking them for taxes at every different turn? Probably not. It boils down to their constituency is welfare claimants now. They're losing votes to the left, to the Greens, who are promising, if you think this is socialism, wait till you see what we've got. They're losing votes to the right, to Reform, because they refuse to get to grips with immigration beyond a few sound bites, such as smash the gangs. So they're losing votes all over the place. And it's a very strange phenomenon because they've got still a majority of historic proportions. So it's very, very novel to see a party who've won so successfully to be this bad, this quickly. And if an election was held tomorrow, you'd argue that they wouldn't get in. The only way they would claw their way in would be in some coalition with the Greens, the Lib Dems, and maybe a few others.
Yeah, and you mentioned Reform there and the difficulty Labour has on the immigration issue in particular, and a lot of what they're trying to do is really more just sound bites. Is this 2-child benefit cap removal a potential vulnerability here? Because, of course, as we know, a lot of those with larger families will actually be foreign nationals. Is that something that you expect Reform will be attacking them on?
Perhaps, although if I remember correctly, maybe they've changed tax since, but I do remember Reform supporting the removal of the 2-child benefit cap. I think from their position, I think they were looking at countries like Hungary, who had used the tax and benefit system to reasonable effect to encourage people to have more children. And there is a demographic crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So I assume that was their original kind of rationality for supporting that removal. Whether they still support it, I don't know, but that has to be a consideration. That has to be a consideration when we've got families who aren't necessarily British nationals, who have very large families. They're given social housing straight away. They are put straight onto benefits. And now it's going to be sort of open season on even more benefits and cementing the current problem that we currently have, rather than starting to try to unpick it, which is what we'd all like to see.
Quite. And so with the budget more broadly then, of course, many of these taxes, they've been earmarked in, and the markets seem to have reacted fairly well to them overall, in that the fiscal situation is going to be consolidated, but they've been earmarked for later in the Parliament, while actual spending is set to rise a bit earlier. Is this a situation of spend now, tax later? And are they actually going to be serious about bringing in these taxes later on, close to an election?
No, it's a very good point. The staging is quite interesting. It leaves the door open for them to say, we don't actually have to do this after all. And they'll be able to paint them as almost tax cuts, even though they're not really, because they're just tax rises that were not introduced. But they can paint them as tax cuts in the run up to the next election if they decide not to go ahead with them. So that is a possibility. But they lack the creativity, the vision to enact proper reform. And until they act proper reform on the tax side and on the public service side, there is no way that they can increase spending in that way without increased borrowing or higher taxes. It's just simple mathematics. So I would anticipate that they would feel that they had to go ahead with them because of the amount of extra spending that they've promised. The way that you can get spending down is to reform public services, and to particularly welfare, particularly healthcare, particularly adult social care. The three big sort of spending challenges we have. But they obviously, in the run to this budget, we can see they lack the imagination to even consider it. All we saw were, how do we tweak the tax levers to try and pay for more spending? That's all we saw in the run up. And the market's responding neutrally, I suppose. 10-year gilts this morning don't look particularly good, but they haven't for a while. But then markets responding neutrally. Everybody kind of knew what was going to happen in the budget, even before the OBR's blunder. It was trailed so much that taxes were going up in one way, shape or form. And they even announced some of the measures before the budget. I know it's a micro issue, but an important one nonetheless. The milkshake tax was announced formally by the health secretary a few days before. So markets have probably priced all of this in. So the lack of movement in one direction or another is probably due to the fact that, well, we all knew what was happening because it's been going on all summer.
And to get into that a little more then, what do you make of this relatively novel strategy of doing all this kite flying? I mean, it's been criticised as talking down the country before the budget and creating all this uncertainty. I mean, was this the right approach, really?
No, awful. It freezes economic activity. We've spoken to numerous businesses who said we're just not going to do anything until we find out what's going on. It's government by media management. It's more of the same that we've seen over the last 2 decades. It's all about what the response is like, as opposed to how is it going to actually improve the country. How is it going to improve economic growth? How is it going to deliver better lives and prosperity for families and businesses? It's not about any of that anymore. It's just government by media management. Bad media management, I've got to say, but government by media management nonetheless. It then starts to feed into these ideas that the OBR isn't fit for purpose, because it becomes a plaything of politicians to say, oh, we've actually found some more headroom, and it all becomes a bit of a game, really. A numbers game. And if you can make the numbers on the spreadsheet add up, then you're fine, as opposed to how does it affect you and I? How does it affect our neighbours down the road? How does it affect the businesses in my local town here in Norfolk where I'm sat? They don't seem to care about that. It's whether the numbers add up on the spreadsheet and whether they can get positive responses on social media and all the rest of it. So it feeds into that idea of whether the OBR should be abolished, even whether the budget itself should be abolished. It's become basically theatre. Extremely damaging theatre. It happens too often. And then we get emergency budgets and autumn statements and spending reviews, and the whole thing feels like a more of a sort of orchestrated kind of play than it is to do with long-term visions for economic growth, which is what the country obviously desperately needs.
Quite. And so we spoke a bit about markets there and the gilt yields. I know that the Taxpayers Alliance is very concerned in particular about the debt and the debt interest and the amount we're paying. I suppose illustrate for us a little bit just how much of a problem that is. But I suppose would there have been an argument to be more hawkish right away simply to get those yields down so we weren't paying so much interest?
Well, there's a way that you can get rid of, you can reduce the debt burden, and that's inflation. And that's what politicians tend to like to do, even though voters absolutely hate inflation, and rightly so. You can inflate away the debt. Another way is through economic growth, because we do measure debt as a proportion of GDP. Well, you don't just have to cut the debt per se. You can grow the economy and make it less of a problem, because as a percent of GDP, it's less of a problem. So they seem to be taking the inflation route, to be honest. They should have, of course, be taking much more drastic action on spending. I think this is the root of all evil in Westminster. Well, all evil, most evil in Westminster at the moment, particularly on the fiscal and economic side, is that there's a general consensus. It's starting to change, I've got to say, but in general, there's a consensus that this is how much we spend. We just need a way to pay for it. And anybody who says, well, how about you reduce spending? You're sort of seen as sort of, that's a bit outlandish, but we've obviously been banging that drum for years that they're spending too much money. What are they spending it on? Is it being spent efficiently? Why can't we reform public services, et cetera, answering those first principle questions rather than, okay, how are we just going to whack everybody for more tax to pay for it? So, of course, we think that there should have been much more drastic action to address that. And the huge problem with the debt in the immediate term is the debt interest, which is now above £100 billion a year. And that's less money for public services. It's less money for tax cuts, which we would like to see also. But that's an enormous amount of money. It's probably approaching somewhere. It's not quite 10%, but it's not getting far off 10% of public spending. So these are enormous bills that we've got to pay year on year just to service the debt. Now, of course, part of the reason is because a higher proportion of our debt is index linked than other countries. And that was a deliberate choice in the early 1980s to try and get inflation under control. But now we've got high debt interest. And yesterday's Red Book showed that inflation is actually going to be higher than originally forecast.
Of those two choices to deal with the debt, it seems we're very much going with inflation rather than economic growth. Which, of course, is perhaps a surprise given last year. That was all you heard about, supposedly from Rachel Reeves. Growth is our focus. That's the one thing we're laser focused on, you kept hearing. I suppose, how will this budget be for growth? I suppose it really got that in mind, but it seems to me there's two key issues here. There's the minimum wage hike and this environment of no productivity increases, of course. And likewise, not part of the budget itself, but the employment rights bill that's due to come in, which is also going to whack businesses with a lot of extra costs for taking on new employees.
Yeah, and the growth forecast yesterday, again, were pitched lower than they were previously. And the employment rights bill was not added into the forecast at all. So if growth forecasts are coming down, then you throw that into the mix, it's going to have an even more deleterious effect. The minimum wage is something that's coming up more and more now. And my background is my family were in the pub business, and the pub is very much a good sort of case study for employing young people. You employ young people on temporary contracts quite often. When people come home for Christmas from university, they get their first job, they learn discipline, how to be part of a team, how to turn up on time, all of these basic things, social skills, all of that kind of good stuff, and they're all being priced out of it. The increase in the minimum wage at such pace and speed above earnings and inflation, pitched alongside an increase in employers' national insurance and a reduction at the threshold at which it starts as well, has been hugely damaging for businesses like that, for cafes, for walk up and down a high street. They're the business that have been impacted by this stuff. So where does the growth come from? It tends to come from small businesses. large businesses all well and good, but they don't really drive growth in the same way because they're quite sort of slow and bureaucratic, but doing important jobs or whatever. But the growth really and dynamic growth comes from small, innovative businesses that move at speed and scale, and they're the ones that are being hit by all of this stuff. So the minimum wage is coming much more as a huge factor. And another interesting point on the minimum wage is as an employee, if you're going to choose between two jobs, it kind of reduces that incentive to go for one that's slightly more hardworking, slightly more dynamic. You might choose something a bit slower, a bit safer. So it kind of kills that on enterprise on the employee side as well. So it's become hugely damaging. And what needs to be done with the minimum wage? It's here now. You probably can't get rid of it. So at the very least, you just need to peg it so that it only goes up with average earnings more generally, or some other metric. But it does need to be permanently pegged rather than increased so that everybody can pat themselves on the back in the House of Commons.
And so, while I realize this may be a difficult question, John, but were there any positives out of this budget?
Sure. Well, on Motability, which is the scheme by which you can use your enhanced personal independence payment, that's for people receiving benefit with disability, and you can use that payment to offset against having a new car. And Motability was originally for people with serious disabilities, with modified cars to help them get around, which nobody could really argue with at all. But what we see now is, of course, the TPA actually produced a big dashboard of benefit spending not too long ago, and we found cases of people claiming new cars for conditions such as tennis elbow, writer's cramp, acne, and the list goes on. And these aren't just any cars; these are Mercedes and Audi. So the one thing that she announced yesterday was to clamp down on luxury cars being claimed for. Fine, but it doesn't really address the core issue of what enhanced PIP and its link to Motability is actually for. It's much more for people who have severe physical disabilities, as opposed to what we see the scheme being rinsed for now. So that was kind of window dressing for me, albeit some step in the right direction. But 1 in every 5 new car on the road is a Motability car. And it tells you what the scale of the problem is.
Well, and so good to see them getting a grip on that a little bit.
Yeah.
So moving on, there's the tax burden overall, of course. That is an issue that people will be very concerned about. But also from economics perspective, what you don't want is to have taxes that are too distortionary and that create perverse incentives in various different areas of the economy. And so, of some of those that were brought in, what do you think were the most distortionary and are the ones that affect things in the most perverse way?
Yeah, well, anything around cliff edges is always pretty distortionary. So again, I'd go back to the salary sacrifice stuff. Anything that doesn't deal with those cliff edges completely distorts economic activity to start with. So that's one, and then you've got the so-called mansion tax, which is an increase. They're using council tax ban to increase to implement an annual charge for homes above 2 million, and then a graduated rate that goes up for a home above 5 million. Now, what was the issue there? There is a point to be made there that actually there are people who are quite wealthy, live in very nice houses, that pay the same council tax as somebody in a flat in Blackpool. That is the case. That does happen. Is that a problem? If so, how does one fix it? You don't do it this way. What's going to happen, of course, is if you have a cliff edge at 2 million, you might see a lot of houses being sold for 1.99 million rather than 2. Same at the 5 million mark. So cliff edges create that distortionary effect. And it was the same when stamp duty was based on a slab rate rather than the graduated rate, even though the rates are far too high and should be abolished. But it used to be on a slab rate, but you used to get lots of house prices, house sales happening around those margins. And then all of a sudden somebody wants to pay 10 grand to leave the dishwasher there. Surprise, surprise. But, that creates huge distortionary effects, and there was a much more effective way to address those problems if they wanted to. But they're not really, as we've been saying all along, they're not really interested in fixing problems for the long term. They just wanted to please the backbenchers. They could say that they put a mansion tax in, that's it. And I think it's down to much more than that. But the economic effects are going to be pretty distortionary.
Yeah, and in terms of almost class war style policies like a mansion tax, it's interesting because, of course, we've heard for a while that politics has moved on from left and right a bit. There's been a realignment on various issues, but it does seem in a way that we're coming back to those quite basic economic arguments of the late 20th century. In that you have the right saying, well, we need to be more fiscally conservative, and you have the left saying we're for more spending. I mean, is it a sort of reversion to type in that way? Sort of.
There's yes buts within that. I think immigration's a key point in there. I'd say that fiscal liberals of years gone by have been a bit more relaxed about immigration because they were bought into this idea that it somehow stimulated economic growth in ways in which it wasn't doing at all. GDP per capita was overlooked for the overall number of GDP. So there are nuances within that, but I think there's also another element to this, which is a kind of I think people are starting to see what Labour are doing as a profound attack on a British way of life. So there's a sort of patriotic national kind of element to this, which is to say that somebody who lives in rural or small town Britain could probably go about their life without engaging all that much with the state. If they've got a decent job, they might put their kid through private school, they've got a decent pension, they've got a family-owned business, they might be, have some kids to pass down that business to. They basically don't engage with the state unless they get sick. Even then, they might have private healthcare. That was seen as a good British way of life, smacks of liberty, like genuine liberty, being able to live your own autonomous life, but placed within your community. That's clearly under threat. Labour don't like that. They don't like that you've got a pension. They don't like that there's agricultural land that's being passed down to the next generation to nurture and be stewards of. All for paltry incomes, by the way, in most cases. They just don't like that sense that they're not in control. And so that idea that they can control people by taking their money is people can feel it and they can see it. And it's funny, people in SW1 in Westminster, they get a shock when they go out to the rest of the country, and travel around like I do, or like our team at the CPA do. Not everybody thinks in the way that Labour backbench MPs do, should we say. There's a lot of anger out there for exactly the reasons I've just been outlining, a real fundamental attack on people's way of life and their liberty.
John Connell, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Well, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Now, this month, Brazil hosted the 30th Conference of the Parties Climate Summit, with Green Zealot delegates jetting in from around the world. But with the US not even attending, few have been paying much attention. So has COP flopped? And what does this mean for the wider net zero agenda? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Tilak Doshi, who's the Daily Sceptic's energy editor. Welcome, Tilak.
Thank you, Laurie. Glad to be here.
Yeah, good to have you here. So plenty to get into today, but of course it's been COP number 30 in Brazil, in the middle of a rainforest, in fact. And well, you've written about that this week. You've described it as Trump's Eisenhower moment. So tell us a bit about that, I suppose, but also just give us an idea of, well, how did COP go this year? Was anyone listening?
Yeah, I think it was pretty much a flop, as some people have termed it, the COP flop. And it seems that Trump made more of an impact by his absence rather than his presence. The fact that the largest financial donor to most global initiatives is missing from action took a lot of wind out of the COP sail. And as expected, none of the usual statements of agreement were convincing, or there was hardly much agreement on any actual decision to do anything really. It was pretty much kicking the ball down in the long grass. Even the mass media couldn't paper over the cracks. Politico put a spin in saying that the fact that the US wasn't there allowed the petrostates and some of the BRICS countries.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.